All right, let's get into it. Like the video, subscribe, and let me know you're here. The air in the transport bay was cold, artificially conditioned against the oppressive heat waiting outside, yet thick with the heavy scent of lubricant and nylon webbing. Sergeant Major Haskins stood braced against the metallic shutter of the aircraft, his attention fixed on the 5 operators clustered before him. Discipline was the only negotiable currency in their line of work, and in this squad, it was valued above gold. Every movement was precise, economical, and silent. Haskins shifted the weight of his primary weapon, an older model carbine, confirming the sling was tight across his chest. He watched Specialist Vaughn, positioned immediately to his left, running a gloved hand over the composite shell of his helmet, checking the retention strap for the 3rd time. The rhythmic clack of magazine checks provided a low background cadence. Each man carried a standard 7-magazine loadout for his rifle, 2 secondary pistol magazines, and 3 fragmentation grenades. A minimal sustainment package for a rapid, targeted extraction operation. The objective, a low-slung structure housing a high-value asset, was 6 miles inland, in the contested suburbs of an unnamed city. Haskins raised his left hand, flashing 3 digits, then cycling them to 2. 2 minutes to drop. The operators responded with brief, sharp nods. They were wearing standard-issue combat uniforms, muted in a flat, arid palette designed to absorb ambient light. Their ballistic vests, weighted with ceramic plates, added 40 pounds of concentrated mass, a burden felt acutely after hours of forced stillness. The internal logic of the mission demanded that they operate within a defined window, 30 minutes on the ground maximum, before high-speed interceptors mobilized by the local defense forces. A sudden, deafening increase in engine noise signaled their proximity. The ramp began to lower, flooding the dark bay with scorching, dust-laden air. The temperature immediately spiked 90 degrees Fahrenheit, forcing a reflex gasp of moisture back into their masks. Haskins felt the heat press against the exposed skin of his neck. The transport aircraft, a heavy tactical variant, stabilized in a high hover, the churning rotors kicking up a blinding curtain of fine grit and pulverized concrete. The landing area was a shallow depression littered with debris from previous, long-forgotten engagements. Haskins' voice, channeled through the internal communication system, was flat and devoid of inflection.
Drop.
The primary rope descended 10 feet to the ground. Corporal Jessup, the team's designated point man, was the first down, disappearing instantly into the blinding dust cloud. Haskins followed immediately, sliding rapidly down the thick nylon braid. The friction heat burned faintly through his reinforced gloves. Haskins hit the ground, planting his boots firmly and immediately dropping into a low, kneeling position. The dust was suffocating, instantly coating his lenses and filling the gaps in his gear. He toggled his vision systems from thermal to basic optical, filtering the particulate interference. He swept his rifle across the immediate perimeter. Jessup was already moving, securing the first 30 feet of arc. Gunner Reynolds moved north, establishing a sustained fire sector behind the wreck of a civilian truck chassis. Specialist Reese, the designated marksman, broke off and began the climb toward a low, rubble-strewn rise, the only dominant elevation within a quarter mile. Vaughn, moving with a slight, almost imperceptible drag on his right leg, an old training injury, secured the south flank. Haskins calculated their dispersion time, 12 seconds from the ramp dropping to all personnel established on the ground and moving toward the objective. Perfect execution. The objective was visible now through the lingering haze of rotor wash. It was a bunker-like structure, low and aggressively fortified, constructed entirely of pre-stressed concrete. The windows were mere slits, embrasures designed only for outgoing fire. The entry point, a heavy steel door set into a recessed alcove, seemed too easy. Haskins reached the edge of a collapsed cinder-block wall, Vaughn moving immediately to cover his 3. He checked his internal display. The objective was 200 yards ahead. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the distant, high-pitched whine of the retreating aircraft and the crunch of their own boots on the broken ground. The lack of ambient noise confirmed a vacuum, not an occupied zone. Haskins brought his rifle up, thumbing the white light emitter. He did not engage the laser designator. He used hand signals to indicate an immediate, aggressive approach. Single file, rapid movement, minimal visibility exposure. They began to close the distance. Every fiber of Haskins' training screamed that something was fundamentally wrong with the symmetry of the silence. They were too disciplined, too exposed, moving toward a fortress that should have registered their presence minutes ago. He took the final, measured steps toward the steel door, the weight of the moment pressing down like the ballistic plating on his chest. 100 yards. The target structure loomed, silent and inert. Haskins transitioned to a crouch, ready to move when Jessup reached the door. The moment of maximum exposure was now. Jessup had his hand extended, reaching for the heavy steel latch of the door, when the world dissolved into percussion. The explosion detonated not inside the building, but directly beneath the concrete slab forming the entrance alcove. It was shaped to maximize upward fragmentation and concussive force. The roar was immediate, violent, and blinding. Haskins, 20 feet back, felt the air sucked from his lungs. The blast wave struck his armor like a sledgehammer, driving him backward onto the gritty soil. Shrapnel, pulverized concrete, and small steel fragments rained down. He recovered instantly, rolling onto his chest and forcing his vision to stabilize. The primary entrance was now a jagged cavity of smoking rebar. Jessup was gone, absorbed by the violence. Before Haskins could issue an ordered response, the return fire began. It was calculated and devastating. Heavy machine guns, firing from 3 distinct, mutually supporting positions, 2 on the roof of the objective, 1 angled from a neighboring ruined warehouse, locked onto their immediate area of deployment. The stream of fire tore through the cinder block barrier where Haskins had momentarily paused. The sustained impact felt less like gunfire and more like a high-pressure jet washing away the structure. Haskins shouted into the communication system, scrambling backward. He hammered the transmit button for the transport aircraft, demanding air support and extraction vector reassessment.
Contact, heavy, 3 positions.
The only sound in his earpiece was a clean, dead hiss, the white noise signature of jamming and signal degradation. Communications were 0. They were cut off. Reynolds, the heavy gunner, attempted to suppress the roof positions, laying down short, measured bursts from his squad automatic weapon. But the enemy fire was pre-sighted and impenetrable. Reese, the marksman on the rise, was pinned, unable to angle down on the roofline without exposing himself to the 3rd position. Haskins saw Vaughn stumble, his rifle dropping momentarily to his side. Vaughn clutched his left shoulder, immediately above the armor plating. Haskins saw the dark, spreading stain blooming across the arid camouflage fabric. A bullet found the seam, traversing soft tissue and fracturing the clavicle. Haskins yelled,
Vaughn, cover!
Vaughn did not reply with words. He stabilized his rifle with his right hand against his hip and fired a 3-round burst toward the nearest rooftop position, his face pale and drawn tight with pain. He moved with practiced urgency, dragging his wounded side, seeking the shelter of a skeletal, burnt-out civilian vehicle 50 feet away. The machine gun fire followed Vaughn, stitching a rapid line of impacts across the chassis. The thin metal offered only psychological cover, spraying rust and molten steel dust with every hit. Haskins provided covering fire, emptying half a 30-round magazine toward the 3rd enemy position, forcing their gunner to momentarily depress his barrel. He sprinted toward Vaughn's position, reaching the car wreck and dropping heavily beside him. Haskins demanded, pressing hard on the wound location through Vaughn's gear to slow the hemorrhage.
Status,
Vaughn managed, his breathing shallow and rapid.
High velocity, through and through. Hurts.
He was already fumbling with a pre-packed individual first aid kit, attempting to apply a pressure dressing with one operational hand. The remainder of the squad, Reynolds and Reese, were isolated near the original landing zone, attempting to form a defensive perimeter, but facing fire from 3 convergent axes. The trap was comprehensive, geometrically sound, and expertly executed. Another, far heavier explosion ripped through the air, directly impacting the roof of the ruined warehouse that had been providing cover to Reynolds. This was high-explosive ordnance. A mortar round impacted the structure. The entire facade of the warehouse crumpled inward with a sickening sound of groaning metal and disintegrating concrete. A massive dust cloud billowed out, momentarily obscuring the battlefield. When it cleared, the positions held by Reynolds and Reese were separated from Haskins and Vaughn by a sheer wall of fallen debris and smoke. Haskins realized the brutal efficiency of the enemy. They had neutralized the entry point, eliminated the primary communication link, inflicted a critical casualty, and divided the remaining fighting force into isolated, vulnerable pairs. They were sealed in a circuit of fire with no exterior connections. Haskins checked the chamber of his rifle. He started the day with 210 rounds. He had 60 rounds remaining. Vaughn was down to 40. Haskins ordered, pushing Vaughn toward a narrow alleyway choked with burning refuse.
We egress south-southwest, immediate. We are not fighting this. We are running.
Haskins gripped the shoulder straps of Vaughn's ballistic vest, dragging his injured subordinate through the alleyway. The smoke, heavy and oily from burning synthetics and pulverized rubber, coated the back of Haskins' throat, eliciting a dry, harsh cough that he immediately stifled. The machine gun rounds followed them, impacting the rough concrete walls with a sound like tearing fabric, the fragmentation kicking up stinging clouds of dust and fine gravel above their heads. Vaughn's weight was a severe, immediate constraint on speed and maneuverability. Haskins forced himself into a loping stride, conserving energy while maximizing ground covered. He knew, with the stark, cold certainty of a combat professional, that if they slowed to a walk, they would be fixed and eliminated within seconds. They ran for 3 city blocks, using the skeletal remains of apartment structures for sporadic cover. The pursuit noise began to fade, confirming the enemy was securing the initial position and prepping for a systematic sweep, not a headlong chase. Haskins shoved Vaughn through a gaping hole in a collapsed foundation wall and dropped down into a ruined storage basement. The air here was cool, stale, and smelled of damp earth, mildew, and ancient oxidized metal. Vaughn slumped against a support pillar, his breathing rapid and shallow. The pressure dressing applied in the field was saturated, dark patches spreading rapidly through the cotton. Haskins immediately cut away the fabric of Vaughn's uniform shirt to properly assess the entry and exit wounds. The damage was localized, a clean track that had passed near the shoulder joint, but the blood loss was significant. Vaughn operated on pure, adrenalized will. Haskins ordered, his own hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the brutal exertion of the sprint.
Magazines. Inventory.
Vaughn, moving stiffly, pulled his remaining ammunition pouches forward. 2 30-round magazines for his rifle. He also produced a compact, stainless steel revolver from a hidden pouch on his belt. It contained 6 rounds. Haskins checked his own supplies. 1 magazine in the weapon, 2 spares on his plate carrier. 90 rounds remaining for the carbine, plus his standard sidearm, a pistol with 12 rounds. Total fighting capability: 5 rifle magazines, 1 revolver, 1 pistol. They were past the point of sustained engagement capability. Haskins keyed his defunct radio one more time, running a narrow frequency sweep on the transmission band. Nothing. Only the steady, rhythmic hiss confirmed the presence of a robust, localized jamming field. He leaned back against the concrete pillar, the rough surface grating against his exhausted muscles. He ran the tactical data in his mind, stripping away emotion and focusing only on system logic. The ambush was too precise. The jamming was immediate and effective. The enemy deployment was pre-planned, timed to coincide exactly with their extraction window. No local militia or disorganized force possessed the intelligence or the logistical discipline to execute this. The target asset was a phantom. The operation was designed solely for their destruction. Someone knew the precise time, vector, and composition of their squad. Haskins stared into the darkness of the basement. The coordinates had been transmitted with surgical accuracy. This was internal, a data leak, a deliberate act of treachery at the highest levels of the command structure. They had been sold out. A distant sound penetrated the thick concrete, a rhythmic, high-frequency hum growing louder. It was too fast for a conventional aircraft, too specific for environmental noise. Vaughn muttered, recognizing the sound profile instantly.
Drone, high-altitude scout, looking for heat signatures.
The realization solidified Haskins' tactical framework. They were not missing personnel. They were active, unauthorized targets. The scout drone coordinated a recovery unit, the same professional mercenaries who had sprung the trap. Haskins looked at Vaughn. The decision was absolute, logical, and inevitable. Haskins stated, keeping his voice low and firm,
We are deceased. Our names are not in the manifest. Our mission failed. The transport reported a full loss of contact and signal integrity. We do not have a headquarters. We do not have rules.
Vaughn nodded, accepting the new reality without argument. The system of military order had failed them. They now operated outside all established parameters, utilizing the constraints of their presumed status as a defensive advantage. They were now unauthorized assets, and unauthorized assets could not be targeted by conventional search and destroy protocols. Their primary objective shifted from extraction to surviving long enough to identify the architect of their elimination. Night brought the rapid descent of desert cold, a heavy, invasive chill that seeped directly into bone marrow. The sweat accumulated during the earlier sprint turned clammy and served only to draw heat rapidly from their core temperatures. They spent the transition hours in absolute silence, allowing the cold to suppress the pursuit of the heat-seeking drones. Vaughn worked methodically on his shoulder wound. He used the minimal lighting provided by Haskins' helmet-mounted red filter. The initial dressing was peeled away, revealing the angry, swollen tissue. Vaughn gritted his teeth, a low, grinding sound audible only to Haskins, as he wrapped a new, sterile bandage tightly and then cinched a nylon cord tourniquet above the injury, creating intense, controlled pressure. The pain was designed to keep him focused, a harsh anesthetic. He breathed through his nose, refusing to allow a single involuntary gasp to escape. When Vaughn was finished, he looked at Haskins and simply nodded. The cost of mobility was accepted. They moved at midnight, navigating the intricate system of drainage canals and buried culverts that crisscrossed the suburban periphery. This subterranean route provided protection from the increasingly effective thermal signature tracking employed by the mercenaries. The shadows were an active, measurable ally, providing an 18-degree Fahrenheit drop in ambient temperature compared to the exposed rubble. Movement was slow and grueling. Haskins moved in the lead, sweeping his rifle across the narrow, enclosed spaces, constantly fighting the urge to stand upright. Vaughn followed, often crawling, protecting his wounded side from abrasion against the rough concrete. After 2 hours of subterranean transit, they emerged near a primary access road. A makeshift block post had been established, manned by an organized security team. The deployment was predictable. A heavy metal barrier, 2 uniformed sentries near the traffic control point, and a light patrol vehicle parked 20 yards back, its headlights illuminating the crossing. Haskins dropped prone behind a low retaining wall, pulling Vaughn down beside him. The sentries appeared relaxed, relying on technology and not physical security. Haskins whispered, his voice barely disturbing the air.
2 visible, 1 at the barrier, 1 pacing the vehicle.
They needed water, and they needed ammunition they could not scavenge from their current location. The decision was logistical necessity. Haskins pulled a combat knife from his chest rig, the 6-inch blade catching the ambient moonlight. He analyzed the sentry's patrol pattern, a 12-foot rotation, pausing for approximately 3 seconds at the extreme of his perimeter. Haskins instructed Vaughn.
I take the primary. You neutralize the second and secure resources. No rifle noise. Use the sidearm.
Vaughn nodded, gripping the compact revolver tightly. The weapon's heavier projectile and reduced muzzle flash made it a discreet, short-ranged tool for elimination. Haskins began his approach, moving not across the open ground, but using the acoustic dead zone near the low wall. He moved with the precision of a trained predator, his boots barely displacing the gravel. He reached the first sentry just as the man reached the apex of his patrol, his back momentarily turned toward the drainage channel exit. Haskins closed the distance in 2 steps. He used the butt of his pistol grip, impacting the sentry's temple with controlled force, achieving immediate neurological incapacitation. Before the body could slump, Haskins drew the knife across the sentry's throat, a swift, practiced motion that severed the primary circulation in one pass. The man dropped silently, the pooling blood absorbed rapidly by the dusty ground. Death was swift and soundless. The second sentry, pausing near the patrol vehicle, was distracted by a static burst from his handheld radio. Vaughn raised the revolver, extending his arm straight out, stabilizing the weapon with his unwounded hand. He fired once. The suppressed thump of the specialized subsonic round was immediately followed by the sound of the sentry collapsing into the light pole. Haskins secured the primary sentry's gear. 2 full rifle magazines, a clean canteen, and a field radio, which Haskins immediately rendered inert. Vaughn was already pulling supplies from the second man and checking the patrol car, securing 2 more full canteens and a bandolier of ammunition. They slipped back into the drainage system, leaving 2 professionally eliminated sentries and 2 full water containers richer. The total tactical cost had been 1 revolver round. The exchange was favorable. The arid territory offered no concession to the daylight. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the heat became a physical force, radiating off the sun-baked concrete and broken asphalt. Haskins watched the air shimmer, creating deceptive, distorting mirages of stability where only ruin existed. The lack of water, even with the scavenged supply, became a critical constraint. They rationed fluid intake to 4 sips every 30 minutes. The mercenaries operated with enhanced coordination. Haskins observed their deployment from a half-collapsed water tower structure. The enemy forces were not merely patrolling, they were establishing fixed, overlapping fields of fire across all major traffic arteries and intersections. At least 3 distinct heavy machine gun nests were visible within a 1-mile radius, designed for interception and rapid elimination. This confirmed the pursuit was not local or opportunistic. This was the work of a highly trained, professionally organized security force focused entirely on termination. Haskins used a captured monocular to observe a patrol of 5 men moving through a nearby market ruin. He focused on their communication gear, specifically the sophisticated specialized throat microphones and integrated helmet systems. He identified the model instantly. It was the same proprietary encryption gear used by high-end contract security specialists, frequently associated with clandestine operations managed indirectly through Washington, District of Columbia, the operational arms of Langley. The confirmation settled heavily in Haskins' mind. The betrayal was concrete, sourced directly from their own intelligence structure. They were being hunted by proxies authorized by the very hierarchy they were sworn to protect. Beside him, Vaughn shifted, his breath whistling slightly. The fever, a consequence of the untreated soft tissue trauma, began to cloud his focus. His face was flushed, despite the intense dryness of the air. Haskins commanded, using the lowest possible tone.
Concentrate.
Vaughn tightened his grip on his rifle, the knuckles white against the dark polymer furniture. He fought the internal system failure with sheer will, forcing the physical reaction of pain and illness into the background of his perception. Vaughn reported, his analysis accurate.
They're sweeping the central factory district next. Too many blind corners and deep shadows. They want to neutralize the evasion paths.
They had been observing the factory for 2 hours. It was a sprawling complex of reinforced concrete and abandoned steel. They located an ingress point, a wide, dust-choked ventilation shaft leading into the sublevel utility areas. They descended into the shaft, the air immediately cooling by 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The metallic echoes of their movement were contained by the dense layers of insulation and dust. They established an observation point, peering through a broken grate onto an internal staging area. Below them, 3 heavily armored utility vehicles, military-grade, not local transport, pulled into the yard. Teams disembarked, their movement fluid and aggressive, immediately establishing a patrol rotation. These were the core elements of the pursuit. Haskins reviewed his remaining resources. 40 rifle rounds, Vaughn's revolver, 2 water bottles. Survival required movement, but movement was impossible without data. Haskins calculated aloud.
They're coordinating operations from a forward tactical hub, a local communications site they appropriated. They need to monitor their sweep teams, control the drone feeds, and uplink to their principals. If we hit the hub, we interrupt their control system, but more importantly, we access the system data.
Vaughn looked up, his feverish eyes clear with understanding.
The objective remains the origin of the kill order.
Precisely. We don't run from unauthorized assets. We find the person who signed the authorization, and we transfer the responsibility back to them.
The communications node, based on the frequency and density of observed transmission signatures, was located in a dilapidated 3-story administrative building 3/4 of a mile east. It was high risk, requiring transit across open ground, but it offered the only viable path to identify their betrayer. Haskins finalized the plan, confirming the sequence of approach and breach. Survival depended on speed, precision, and the calculated disruption of the enemy's system architecture. The communications node occupied the top floor of the administrative building, identifiable by the 3 newly installed satellite dishes mounted prominently on the roofline. Haskins and Vaughn approached under the cover of the pre-dawn darkness, utilizing the sporadic shadows cast by the moon. Haskins took point on the entry. The ground floor was secured by a single, poorly positioned guard near the stairwell entrance, clearly relying on technology and not physical security. Haskins used a single, suppressed round from his pistol, aiming for the cranial nerve cluster. The guard collapsed without a sound. They moved rapidly up the 3 flights of stairs. Vaughn, despite the increasing stiffness in his shoulder, handled the ascent with grim determination, keeping his rifle oriented down the stairwell, securing the rear. Reaching the 3rd-floor landing, Haskins confirmed the presence of 3 hostiles inside the tactical center, visible through a partially open doorway. 2 managed communications equipment. 1 stood guard near the central monitor display. Haskins initiated the breach. He pulled the pins on 2 fragmentation grenades simultaneously. He adjusted his stance, waited 1 second, then tossed both into the open doorway. The small, enclosed space amplified the effect. The sequential detonation was sharp, tearing through the gypsum walls and metal partitions. The blast concussive force provided the necessary disorientation and cover. Haskins charged through the rubble-strewn doorway, rifle shouldered. The room was a chaos of smoking electronics and stunned men. He operated on reflex and system, a double tap, center mass, high chest, to the first technician attempting to draw a weapon, a transfer of fire to the center of the mass of the second, and a final, deliberate single shot to neutralize the standing guard before he could bring his carbine to bear. The entire engagement lasted 2.8 seconds. Vaughn took up a position covering the hallway, his breathing heavy, his vision searching for immediate external threats. He fired a short burst down the main corridor, clearing the perimeter and discouraging immediate counterattack. Haskins moved immediately to the command console. The main monitor displayed a proprietary interface, tracking 5 active patrol units and 3 aerial drones. More critically, a secure connection channel pulsed green, labeled Apex Uplink. He pulled a small, ruggedized external solid-state drive from his pouch and plugged it into a free universal serial bus port.
The bandwidth of the uplink was massive. The data streamed in real time, routed through a complex proxy structure, but the terminal address was embedded deep within the header files. Haskins scanned the metadata as the data downloaded. The destination internet protocol resolved to a registered physical location, a server farm in Northern Virginia, clearly operating outside government scrutiny. The link was established. He was retrieving the evidence of command and control. Seconds later, the sound of approaching vehicles and immediate heavy-caliber fire erupted outside. The pursuit had been alerted by the immediate radio silence from the communications hub. The mercenaries reacted aggressively. Bullets penetrated the exterior wall, tearing through the sheet metal siding and ripping chunks of drywall from the interior partitions. Vaughn shouted, leaning into his weapon to suppress the fire attempting to breach the hallway.
"Time is up!" The progress bar on the external drive hit 100%. Haskins ripped the drive free. He activated the small cylindrical thermite charge he had placed near the central processor cluster. Haskins grabbed Vaughn and pushed him toward a maintenance door marked "Emergency Exit Only."
Contact is breaking.
They burst out onto a small loading dock. The thermite charge detonated instantly inside the communications room, generating extreme localized heat designed to melt electronics and fuse metal, erasing any physical evidence of their presence or data extraction. They sprinted down the fire escape and into the narrow back alleys, leaving behind a burning, melting intelligence node. They had the data, but the price was proximity to the core of the enemy operation. The pursuit would now be immediate, relentless, and focused on this confirmed location. The stolen utility vehicle they had commandeered was structurally sound, but functionally slow. They drove east, the heavy engine laboring across the broken asphalt of the service roads. The pursuit found them 3 miles from the communications node. A high-speed armored vehicle closed the distance rapidly, its mounted weapon system acquiring target lock. Haskins registered the muzzle flash in his peripheral vision and simultaneously heard the impact. A stream of heavy-caliber ammunition stitched across the back of their stolen transport. The immediate catastrophic consequence was the shattering of the radiator housing. A blinding plume of scalding white steam erupted over the windshield, instantly obliterating Haskins' forward visibility. Haskins yelled, forcing the steering wheel hard to the right, angling the vehicle into a controlled skid toward a pile of wrecked concrete drainage pipes.
Eject!
Haskins kicked his door open while the vehicle was still moving, rolling hard onto the abrasive, loose gravel shoulder. The impact was sharp, sending a jolt of pain up his spine, but he retained control of his rifle. He scrambled back to his knees, ignoring the pain, and opened fire immediately on the pursuing vehicle, targeting the front tires and the exposed engine block. The tires deflated with loud, tearing sounds, sending the pursuit vehicle into an uncontrollable yaw. Vaughn, moving slower but with purpose, exited the passenger side. He was breathing through his mouth, his face slick with sweat and grime, fighting the onset of shock. He pulled the last remaining fragmentation grenade from his pouch, pulled the pin, waited exactly 2 seconds, and lobbed the device directly underneath the stopped pursuit vehicle. The explosion was muffled by the undercarriage, but effective. It initiated a secondary detonation, the vehicle's fuel cell, sending a geyser of flame and smoke into the desert sky. The distraction was total, but temporary. Haskins grabbed Vaughn and dragged him toward the nearest feature of geological protection, a series of low, sharp rock formations marking the entrance to a dried-out river gorge. They scrambled into the gorge, immediately gaining vertical cover, but sacrificing flat ground movement. Every step was now a precise, painful negotiation of jagged edges and unstable footing. The accumulated exhaustion of 3 days without rest or proper nutrition began to manifest as sharp, intense joint pain. Haskins felt a constant, deep ache in his lower back and shoulders, the consequence of carrying heavy gear and Vaughn's weight. They were in a canyon, but they were not alone. Haskins heard the distant, sharp barking of trained military working dogs,
tracking animals, deployed to follow the scent trail into the difficult terrain. He also observed faint, moving points of light reflecting off the high canyon walls, the infrared beams of night vision goggles being used for daytime visual verification in deep shadow. The mercenaries used highly organized assets and specialized equipment to negate their environmental advantage. Haskins checked his internal map display. The electronic border marker, their only chance for non-hostile contact, was 4.5 miles away, across a final, wide-open expanse of cracked clay and sand dunes. Haskins reported, knowing the distance represented the total remaining capacity of their physical systems.
4.5 miles, Vaughn.
Vaughn nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. His breathing was rapid, shallow, and controlled.
We need to gain distance before sunset. Dogs operate best in low light.
Haskins examined the steep, abrasive walls of the gorge. They had to abandon the canyon soon. The mercenaries would simply fix their location and neutralize them with precise, indirect fire from the ridgeline. They had traded immediate death for a protracted, grinding march toward an inevitable confrontation. The systems of exhaustion and pursuit were closing in rapidly. The wind changed direction abruptly at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, carrying with it a colossal wall of fine particulate matter. The sandstorm arrived as a violent, instantaneous collapse of visibility. Within 90 seconds, the bright desert sun was extinguished, replaced by a dense, churning, yellow-orange chaos. Visibility dropped to less than 5 yards. The gritty, abrasive sand immediately clogged the intake of their lungs, filled their eye sockets despite their goggle seals, and penetrated the intricate mechanical tolerances of their weapon systems. Haskins seized the opportunity the storm presented, a complete system disruption. The thermal imaging of the pursuit teams was negated by the heat differentials caused by the wind and the high-friction static electricity generated by the dust. The sound of the working dogs was swallowed by the wind's shriek. But the storm was an equalizing hazard. They could easily lose each other. Haskins quickly produced a 10-foot length of thin parachute cord from his survival kit and tied one end securely to his own plate carrier and the other to Vaughn's. They were tethered, forced to move as one unit against the suffocating wind. They continued their measured advance toward the open plain. Vaughn's gait, previously determined, became erratic. His right leg buckled abruptly. He fell hard onto the sand, crying out once before the sound was snatched away by the wind. Haskins immediately pulled back on the tether, dropping beside him. Vaughn's injured knee, compensating for the wounded shoulder, succumbed to the constant load and strain. Vaughn shook his head, pushing Haskins' hands away.
No, Haskins, the data. You have to move. I slow you down too much. Go!
The order was logical. Vaughn's elimination would increase Haskins' survivability and, consequently, the successful transmission of the intelligence. Haskins stared into Vaughn's sand-caked face. The bond between them, forged in countless operations, superseded the logic of the tactical equation. He did not speak. He simply shifted his rifle to a secured position, reached under Vaughn's armpit, and hoisted him up, shifting the full weight of the operator and his gear onto his own shoulders. The movement was agonizing. Haskins moved forward, his legs pumping against the resistance of the deep, shifting sand, his head bowed against the wind. Vaughn's body was a sticky, feverish burden, yet the act of bearing the weight provided a focus that superseded the overwhelming physical fatigue. They stumbled into the open ground of the plain. The sandstorm intensified, creating swirling eddies that confused directionality. Then, they collided with resistance. 4 figures emerged from the immediate swirling dust, mercenaries who had taken shelter immediately upon the storm's onset and were now moving randomly to re-establish contact. The confrontation was immediate and chaotic. It was close quarters, desperate, instinctual violence. Haskins dropped Vaughn behind a small ridge, drew his fighting knife, and engaged the nearest threat. He parried a bayonet thrust, the metal ringing sharply, and drove his blade into the mercenary's flank. The next enemy rushed him, utilizing the stock of his rifle as a blunt weapon. Haskins ducked the blow and transitioned instantly to grappling. The fight was silent, exhausting, driven by desperation. Haskins secured a chokehold on the mercenary's throat, his forearms rigid. He squeezed until the body went limp, his fingers cramped and trembling from the exertion, refusing to release until he felt the total absence of resistance. Vaughn, using his compact revolver, dispatched the two remaining targets who were attempting to flank Haskins, the sound of the short, heavy bursts barely audible over the gale. The storm, having fulfilled its purpose as a system disruptor, began to abate as quickly as it had arrived. The yellow chaos bled away, revealing a horizon line of clear, late-afternoon sky. Haskins stood over the bodies, breathing hard, his body saturated with sweat, sand, and adrenaline. He retrieved his rifle, checking the mechanisms, which were gritty but still operational. 4 men eliminated, 0 rounds of rifle ammunition expended. They had survived the immediate catastrophic encounter. The border loomed just under 4 miles away. The border was not marked by a simple wire fence. It was a clear, unambiguous statement of separation. A 15-foot-high reinforced concrete barrier topped by multiple layers of coiled razor wire. At intervals of 150 yards, heavy, prefabricated watchtowers were equipped with high-powered searchlights and mounted heavy machine guns. The structure was monumental, a physical representation of the absolute separation between jurisdictions. Haskins and Vaughn reached the perimeter of the final approach, a stretch of flat, open terrain, just as the shadows lengthened. Behind them, 3 fast-moving vehicle signatures appeared, raising thick plumes of reddish-brown dust. The remaining pursuit elements closed rapidly, galvanized by the knowledge that they were nearing their objective. The mercenaries opened fire, long, disorganized streams of tracer ammunition arcing through the air, their intent solely suppressive. Haskins secured Vaughn behind a half-buried concrete blast block, the only substantial piece of cover available. He conducted a final, grim inventory. He had 20 rounds remaining in his carbine, scavenged magazines contained another 40 rounds, and 3 rounds left in his pistol. He also had the sniper rifle, a standard bolt action, retrieved from the neutralized mercenary team, with 4 rounds taped to the stock. Haskins instructed, passing the ruggedized, solid-state memory stick to Vaughn.
The data drive. There is a technical conduit under the main wall, 300 yards north, drainage runoff. It will be tight, but it is viable.
Vaughn gripped the drive, his hands slick.
I cover you!
Negative. Your objective is the conduit. Mine is to delay the breach long enough for you to reach the threshold.
Haskins positioned the carbine to his left and the bolt-action rifle to his right. He established his final firing line, using the concrete block as the anchor point for a single-man defense. The lead vehicle, ignoring the increasing range of the warning fire from the distant border towers, closed to within 200 yards. It was a tactical error born of arrogance and desperation to complete the mission. Haskins chambered a round in the bolt-action rifle. He sighted through the optic, acquiring the lead driver's face shield. The focus was absolute, the world narrowing to the intersection of the crosshairs and the center of the target. He inhaled, held the breath, and exerted pressure on the trigger. The high-powered rifle cracked, the sound enormous in the gathering twilight. The impact shattered the windshield and immediately neutralized the driver, sending the armored vehicle veering into an uncontrolled high-speed spin. It slammed broadside into a concrete barrier post, eliminating the immediate threat of a rapid assault. The other 2 vehicles braked hard, and a full squad of mercenaries disembarked, immediately establishing a skirmish line and opening up with sustained heavy fire against Haskins' position. The concentrated burst of lead struck the blast block. The sound was a continuous, deafening roar, turning the surrounding air into a mixture of high-velocity fragments, pulverized concrete dust, and hot shrapnel. Haskins felt the concussive force through the ground, the vibrations rattling his teeth. He fired back, using short, precise bursts from the carbine, forcing the advancing line to maintain their cover. He expended the last of the scavenged rifle ammunition, the weapon locking back on an empty chamber. Haskins screamed at Vaughn, pulling the bolt on the sniper rifle again, chambering his last 3 rounds.
Go!
Vaughn, moving with painful slowness, began to crawl toward the north along the base of the wall. He was now operating under extreme suppression fire, the rounds impacting the concrete block structure 10 feet away, turning the air into a haze of gray particulate matter. Haskins knew he had only moments before the line of fire shifted and focused entirely on the crawling figure. The cost of securing the evidence was paid in full. Haskins' primary cover was disintegrating. A heavy caliber round struck the blast block at a weak point, causing a massive structural failure. A large slab of concrete disintegrated and struck Haskins' left side, momentarily stunning him. He shook his head violently, forcing his vision to clear through the lingering dust cloud. He dropped the now empty carbine and transitioned instantly to his secondary weapon, the revolver. The mercenaries, seeing the pause in the volume of fire, began their final coordinated rush. Haskins fired the revolver 3 times, placing the heavy caliber rounds into the chest of the 3 nearest advancing targets. The impacts disrupted the line, forcing the remaining mercenaries to drop back behind cover, temporarily halting the immediate advance. Then, silence. The revolver's cylinder was empty. Haskins dropped the useless weapon onto the sand. He felt the massive impact before he heard the sound. A final high-velocity round struck him squarely on the edge of his ballistic plate carrier. The armor held, but the kinetic energy transfer was catastrophic. It felt like being hit by a train. His diaphragm seized, and the air was driven from his lungs. The impact drove him backward, twisting him sideways before he crashed heavily onto the sand, his helmet visor cracking against the rock. The world contracted immediately into a small, pulsing circle of light and ringing noise. 300 yards north, Vaughn reached the shadow of the border wall. His hands, scraped raw and bleeding from the crawl, found the low, rusted opening of the technical conduit. He pulled the satellite beacon and transmission package from his vest. With his final reserves of strength, he activated the encrypted burst transmission, bypassing all standard operational security channels and sending the intelligence directly to the intended recipient's private address. A protocol established years ago for failure of command integrity. The data packet, the evidence of the Virginia server and the betrayal, was transmitted. Simultaneously, the border observation tower, alerted by the extreme volume of unauthorized incoming fire across the neutral zone, illuminated the battle space with high-intensity searchlights. A concentrated, disciplined stream of heavy machine gun fire erupted from the tower positions, focused on the location of the mercenary vehicles. The mercenaries, realizing the situation had transitioned from a controlled extraction to an international incident involving a third-party security force, immediately ceased their advance and began to withdraw into the deep shadows of the desert. The system of organized pursuit broke contact. Vaughn, prone on the sand, watched the final moments of the conflict. He saw Haskins attempting to push himself up, bracing against the stock of his discarded rifle, a determined shape in the dust. Haskins held the position for 2 seconds, a final, unyielding silhouette, before the heavy fatigue and internal trauma finally overwhelmed him. He fell heavily onto the hot sand. The cost was absolute. Vaughn, having completed the transmission and now safely within the jurisdiction of the Border Patrol, began to pull his body through the conduit, dragging the data and the truth with him. The system of treachery was broken. The data confirmed the origin of the plot. Arrests began immediately in Virginia, disrupting the deep cover infrastructure that had planned the elimination. For the 2 men in the desert, one gone, the other wounded and retreating, the successful transmission of the final signal was the only metric that mattered. The objective was secured.